The Battle of Nashville, how one general's fury led to catastrophe. The road to Nashville began with the disastrous fall of Atlanta in September 1864. Atlanta was the heart of the Confederacy's railroads and manufacturing. Losing it was like having the ground pulled out from under them. General William Tecumseh Sherman of the Union didn't just take Atlanta, he crushed it, both in spirit and in physical reality, leaving the Confederates in tatters. Now, General Hood wasn't the type to admit defeat. Instead of retreating or fortifying, he decided to take the offensive in a move that even some of his closest officers questioned. His plan? March his wounded army north into Tennessee, through fields and towns already exhausted by war, and strike at Sherman's supply lines. If he could lure Sherman out of Georgia, he thought, maybe, just maybe, the South could catch a break. But let's be real, this was less a strategy and more a reckless gamble. Hood's real target, though, was Nashville. A symbol of Union strength and a key to Tennessee. If Hood could reclaim it, he believed it would reignite the Confederate cause. But here's the kicker, he wasn't just fighting an uphill battle, he was marching toward a cliff. His army was badly undersupplied, weary, and outnumbered. Hood's own generals begged him to reconsider. But Hood, with the stubbornness of a mule, pressed on. Before we dive into the bloodbath that was Nashville, we have to take a detour through the rolling hills of Tennessee, where Hood's campaign played out in fits and starts. His first move was to march his army toward Columbia, a sleepy town along the Duck River. It was here that Hood hoped to draw out Union forces under Major General John M. Schofield, who was covering the Union's position between Hood and Nashville. Schofield, a savvy commander, wasn't about to walk into Hood's trap. Instead, he fell back in a series of tactical retreats, forcing Hood to chase him northward, first to Columbia, then to Spring Hill, a small town just south of Franklin. Here, things got messy. Let me paint a picture for you. It's late November 1864, and the Confederate General John Bell Hood, battle-worn, stubborn, and walking on one leg, is marching his army northward through Tennessee. His goal? Cut off the Union Army under Major General John M. Schofield before they can reach the fortified safety of Nashville. The town of Spring Hill is the stage, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If Hood could corner Schofield here, he could prevent the Union from fortifying Nashville and give the Confederates a crucial victory in a war that was quickly spiraling out of their control. But Hood's plan, like so many plans in this war, didn't go quite as intended. In fact, what happened at Spring Hill was a masterclass in military blunders and missed opportunities. And, of course, a dash of Hood's legendary temper. Hood was nothing if not bold. His strategy was simple but effective on paper: cut off Schofield's escape route. The Union general was retreating from Columbia to Nashville, and his troops were stretched thin on the road. All Hood had to do was block the road north, and Schofield would be caught like a rat in a trap. Hood sent one of his best commanders, General Patrick Cleburne, along with Generals Nathan Bedford Forrest, Benjamin Cheatham, and William Bate, to lead the attack on Schofield's rear guard and cut off the road to Franklin. Now, Cleburne was no slouch. He was known as the Stonewall of the West, a fearsome tactician with a reputation for getting things done. This should have been a slam dunk for the Confederates. But what unfolded instead was a chaotic comedy of errors. On November 29, 1864, the day began with high hopes for the Confederates. Hood's army was positioned just south of Spring Hill, ready to strike. They had Schofield's men within reach. All they had to do was block the main road and stop the Union from escaping. Hood gave the orders, and the Confederate forces moved into position. But then, things started to go wrong. Cleburne and his men moved toward the road to cut off Schofield, but something bizarre happened: they stopped. Why? No one's entirely sure, but rumors floated that Cheatham, the division commander, had misunderstood the orders. Instead of pushing forward and sealing off the road, Cleburne's troops halted just short of their objective. Cheatham, for reasons that still baffle historians, either didn't realize how critical the road was or hesitated in executing the attack. Maybe it was exhaustion after weeks of hard marching, or perhaps he thought another part of the Confederate line would handle it. Either way, the opportunity slipped through their fingers. Meanwhile, Schofield and his men were camped out just a couple of miles away, completely unaware of how close they were to disaster. They were sitting ducks, but no one was pulling the trigger. As night fell, Hood grew increasingly impatient. He had trusted his generals to execute the plan, and by all rights, Spring Hill should have been in Confederate hands. But instead of hearing the crack of rifles and cannon fire signaling that the road had been cut off, Hood was met with silence. The sounds of Union wagons continued rumbling through the night as Schofield's men quietly slipped right past the Confederate positions, right under Hood's nose. Hood, camped a few miles south, had no idea that his army had let the Union escape. By the time reports reached him, it was too late. Schofield's entire force had marched right up the road to Franklin, unscathed and unchallenged. To say Hood was angry would be an understatement. When Hood learned that Schofield had escaped, his reaction was legendary. Some reports say that Hood, upon hearing the news, flew into a rage so fierce it left his staff dumbfounded. Eyewitnesses claimed he smashed his hat to the ground, pacing back and forth, cursing his generals for their failure. Others say he grabbed nearby objects, anything within reach, and hurled them in frustration. Some of his officers later described the scene as one of the most fiery outbursts they had ever seen. The most colorful rumor, passed down with a kind of morbid fascination, suggests Hood stomped around the camp, muttering darkly about court-martialing his own generals. "How could they let this happen?" he reportedly fumed. "We had them. Right there. Right in front of us." It wasn't just anger, though. It was bitter frustration. Hood knew that the entire plan had been to trap Schofield, and his generals had let him down in the most spectacular fashion. The escape of the Union Army meant that the Confederates had lost their last, best chance to change the course of the war in Tennessee. Meanwhile, on the Union side, General Schofield was likely just as baffled as Hood, but in a much more pleasant way. Schofield and his officers had fully expected to be attacked that night. Their campfires lit up the dark Tennessee night, and they braced for battle. But hour after hour passed with no sign of the Confederate movement. As Schofield's scouts realized that the road north was still open, he wasted no time. Under cover of darkness, his army packed up and quietly marched right past the Confederate lines. When morning came, Schofield was well on his way to Franklin, leaving Hood fuming in the cold dawn. It was, in every sense, a great escape. Schofield had slipped right through the jaws of Hood's trap without firing a shot. The morning of November 30th, Hood rode to the front to see the situation for himself. What he found was nothing short of infuriating. The Union Army had vanished, leaving only the smoldering campfires of their previous night's encampment. Spring Hill was still in Confederate hands, technically, but that didn't matter. Schofield and his men were gone. Hood's temper boiled over. His army had let Schofield escape without a fight, and now they had no choice but to pursue the Union forces to Franklin, where Schofield was already fortifying his defenses. It was a disaster, plain and simple. Many of Hood's officers, including Cheatham, would later claim that there had been confusion in the ranks, missed orders, and a lack of clarity about what Hood had wanted. But the truth was undeniable: Spring Hill was a colossal missed opportunity. On November 30th, 1864, Hood caught up with Schofield at Franklin. Hood had chased Union General John Schofield for miles, through icy fields and freezing rain, and now, at Franklin, Tennessee, just 20 miles south of Nashville, he had his prey in sight. There was no way, absolutely no way, Hood was going to let Schofield slip through his fingers again. But Franklin was more than just a small Tennessee town. It was a fortress, with Union troops dug in deep behind breastworks, trenches, and barricades. Hood, despite every warning from his subordinates, ordered a full frontal assault. His officers, men like General Patrick Cleburne, General John C. Brown, and others, pleaded with him to reconsider. The Union positions were strong, and a direct assault would be suicidal. But Hood, who had already gambled and lost so much, wasn't about to back down. His blood boiled with frustration. One of his most trusted officers, General Patrick Cleburne, reportedly said to him, "General Hood, charging these works would be madness. We would be walking into the very teeth of the enemy." But Hood wasn't hearing it. He looked Cleburne in the eyes, his face twisted in anger, and said, "It's better to die 1,000 deaths than to let the Yankees slip through my fingers again." And so, at around 4 p.m., as the late November sun began to set over the horizon, Hood gave the order. The Army of Tennessee, already battered and bruised, was to make one last desperate charge. It started like so many other battles in the Civil War, with the deafening roar of artillery. The Confederate forces surged forward, 20,000 strong, across 2 miles of open fields. Cannonballs whistled through the air, and musket fire crackled like deadly fireworks. Hood's soldiers advanced bravely, but it wasn't long before they realized just how heavily fortified Franklin was. Union troops, under the command of General Schofield, were entrenched behind thick barricades, with artillery placed in perfect positions to rain down death upon the advancing Confederates. In those first few moments of the battle, the Confederate soldiers marched as though they had nothing to lose. Hood watched from a hill, his mind filled with a strange mix of hope and fury. But as his men got closer to the Union lines, reality began to set in. Cleburne, one of Hood's most trusted and capable generals, led his men straight into the storm. He was a man of great dignity, always calm under fire, but even he must have known that this charge was madness. As he pushed forward with his division, a bullet found its mark. Cleburne, the Stonewall of the West, fell dead, and with him died much of Hood's remaining hope. And the carnage didn't stop there. General John Adams, leading his brigade, charged on horseback toward a Union barricade, as if to inspire his men by example. He was shot down just as he reached the barricade, his body falling lifelessly from his horse, which leapt over the earthworks in a futile show of defiance. Then there was General Hiram Granberry, another Texan like Hood. He, too, fell in the midst of the chaos. Granberry had fought bravely in battle after battle, but Franklin would be his last stand. General States Right's Gist, yes, that was his real name, fell as well, killed almost instantly as he tried to rally his men through the thick smoke of battle. By the time night fell, Hood had lost 6 of his generals, including Cleburne, Adams, Granberry, Gist, John C. Carter, and Otho Strahl. The Confederate dead littered the field, like autumn leaves blown across the cold, hard ground. In just 5 hours, Hood's army had suffered 6,000 casualties, more than many armies lost in entire campaigns. And what did Hood have to show for it? Nothing. Schofield, ever the pragmatist, didn't wait around to count the dead. Under the cover of darkness, he quietly withdrew his forces and marched north toward Nashville, leaving Hood behind to contemplate the cost of his reckless gamble. After the disaster at Franklin, Hood's army limped towards Nashville. Hood hoped that if he could threaten the city, Union forces might be forced to abandon their advance in Georgia and come to Tennessee's defense. It was a long shot, but Hood was desperate. He encamped his 30,000 men south of Nashville, forming a semicircle around the city. His army was a shadow of its former self. The men were exhausted, starving, and many were without shoes, trudging through the icy mud with rags wrapped around their feet. They were barely more than skeletons in ragged uniforms, clinging to the tattered remains of a dream that had long since died at Franklin. But Hood wasn't done gambling. No, he still believed he could take Nashville, the prize that had eluded him for so long. General George H. Thomas, the Union commander, was waiting for him there, and Thomas was no fool. Known as the Rock of Chickamauga, Thomas was a patient, methodical general, the complete opposite of Hood. While Hood was all about bold, aggressive maneuvers, Thomas preferred to wait, to build his defenses, and to strike only when he was sure of victory. Thomas had spent weeks preparing Nashville for Hood's arrival. The Union defenses were solid: trenches, barricades, artillery placements, and fresh troops ready to fight. If Franklin had been a massacre, Nashville would be the final nail in the coffin. The morning of December 15 dawned cold and gray. Hood's army, reduced to about 20,000 men, faced Thomas's force of nearly 55,000. Hood knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy entrenched behind strong defenses. But what choice did he have? The Confederate cause was already on its last legs. If he retreated now, it would be the end. Thomas, however, wasn't in any rush to attack. For weeks, he had built up his defenses, waiting for the right moment. He knew Hood was desperate and that time was on his side. When Thomas finally gave the order to attack on December 15, it was like watching a slow, methodical machine come to life. The Union artillery opened fire, bombarding the Confederate lines with relentless precision. Hood's men, already demoralized and freezing in the cold December air, could do little more than hold on as wave after wave of Union troops advanced. The Union infantry, well-fed and well-equipped, pushed forward with grim determination. On the second day, December 16, the Confederate line finally broke. Hood's army collapsed, and what was left of his once proud force fled in disarray. By the end of the battle, Hood had lost over 6,000 men, and his army was shattered beyond repair. After Nashville, Hood's career as a commander was effectively over. His once bold, aggressive tactics had led to nothing but bloodshed and defeat. The Army of Tennessee, once the backbone of the Confederate war effort, was all but destroyed. In the months that followed, Hood would be criticized from all sides, by his officers, by the Confederate government, and even by his own men. But for Hood, the hardest part was knowing that he had gambled everything and lost. His dream of recapturing Nashville, of reigniting the Confederate cause, had turned to ash. As one Confederate soldier reportedly said after the Battle of Nashville, "We fought hard, we fought bravely, but General Hood led us to our graves." Years later, reflecting on his choices, Hood would admit, "I believed victory was possible, even in the darkest of times. But I see now that my own stubbornness and pride blinded me to the realities of war. I led brave men to their deaths, and for that, I will always carry the weight of regret." The Battle of Nashville wasn't just the end of Hood's campaign, it was the end of the Confederate hope in the West. And for Hood, it was a bitter reminder that even the bravest of men can fall victim to their own ambition.